So can you talk about when you first learned about Denver?
Yeah. As a part of my book buying disease, I was buying books constantly, and I was on Amazon. In fact, this will tell you, this will sound cheesy. I think I was Googling how to receive the Second Comforter. I didn't care if they were Mormon or not. I wanted to hear about people who had met Christ. I had come to a point in my life where I believed that even Muslims were having encounters with Christ and converting to Christianity, and it had nothing to do with the LDS Church. So I was Googling, and I was brought to an Amazon book called How to Make Your Calling and Election Sure by a couple. I think their last name was Clausen. It was a little skinny white book. And when I saw it, now remember, as you called it rebellion, as rebellious as I was being, I'm very active in the church. I've been conditioned by my reading of Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce R. McConkie at this point, and I'm very careful and I'm very deliberate. And so I see a book like Making Your Calling and Election Sure, and my first thought is, if you're talking about it, you don't know what you're talking about. If you do know what you're talking about, you're not going to write a book about it. I'd been conditioned to think that way, but I still had to buy the book. And so I bought the Clausen book, and as I bought the Clausen book, there was one of those recommendations that shows up at the bottom of the screen, and it says, those who read or liked this book would also like this book, and it had Denver Snuffer's book, The Second Comforter. And I'm reading the description of that, and it's like 400 something pages, and I thought, holy smokes, how do you write a book about this topic that's that many pages? I know what's going to be in these books. I know it's going to be a recycle, repeat, rinse, repeat of Bruce McConkie, Joseph Smith's teachings as they show up in teachings. I know they're going to quote from Roy Doxey in a talk that he gave in General Conference. I'm familiar with all the material. So I order both books, and I get both books, and the first book that I decide to read is the skinnier of the two by the Clausens. And it met my expectation. It's a bunch of recycled quotes, and they didn't seem to have any additional insight that they could share with me about the process. And so I wrote my name in the book and the date in the book like I always did, and I stored it on my Excel spreadsheet of all the books that I was buying and reading, and I stuck it on the shelf. And then I opened Denver's book, and within a chapter, he has at the beginning, I don't know if you've seen in the book, The Second Comforter.
And where is that in the number?
It's the first of the books that he wrote. Okay. I think he wrote it in 2006. It is now 2009, and I've discovered the book. Early 2009, I think. And he starts every chapter with this italicized vignette about his personal life, kind of this journey from childhood all through adulthood, about his time in the Air Force. And then what follows the italicized vignette at the beginning of a chapter is a simple, I mean simple, like what Nephi says about faith. Here's a chapter about repentance, here's a chapter about, simple stuff. And it was so compelling a read. I've read hundreds of books at this point. And there was something that caused me to turn the pages of this book, and I knew from the very beginning that I was anticipating that when I get to the end of this book at some point, this man is going to bear witness that he's met Christ. And that witness was so compelling to me to look for. And so I read every book, every page of that book with anticipation. And I get to the end of the book, and he bears that witness. And I believe that he was telling the truth. And I went to work the next day, flying jets. I went to work the next day and start sharing the book with pilots that I work with who are LDS. And they're reading the books, and they're loving it, and they're saying, this is great. And one of my friends who happens to be out of the Air Force and lives in Heber City now, he says, we've got to take a trip out to Utah and meet this guy. And I said, yes, we do. And we never actually, we never make that happen. I do make that happen. And I happened to be in Utah. I think my brother was living here at the time and might have been in dental school, and so I was visiting with him and some friends. And I decide that I'm going to swing by Denver Snuffer's attorney office. And for the listeners, I don't recommend that course of action, by the way. I'll just throw that out there. That's probably not a good idea, and it's borderline an invasion of someone's privacy. And but I was determined, and so I stopped in the office. And I'd already been reading, I think, his second book, Nephi's Isaiah, and I'm convinced that there's something to this. And I go up to the secretary at the desk in his office, and I say, hey, I'm here to see Denver. And I'm hoping to convey to her that I know who it is that I'm coming to meet with, and he's expecting me. And she is apparently used to that at this point already, because she was very skeptical of me, and with a raised eyebrow, she said, "Does he know who you are?" And I said, "No, he doesn't." She goes back and she talks to him and says, "There's this guy here to see you," and he invites me back to his office. And so this is my introduction to Denver Snuffer's writings, my introduction to the man. And I walk into his office, and he is not wearing a white shirt and tie, and he's got a beard. And it just about blew me away. Because the only people who know God have white shirts on, and they wear a tie, and they have no facial hair.
Just like Jesus.
Just like Jesus.
I'm kidding.
And so I look him up and down, and you have to, and he would you'd expect that I'm being judgmental of this person because I believe what he's written. I'm expecting he's telling the truth, but my purpose in coming is to press him on the matter and to poke and to ask questions. Do a Mormon Stories interview with him in the brief amount of time that I get. And so I look at him, and he's got this plaid shirt on. He's got a belt that's a little bit too long for him. It's one of those leather belts that's kind of thin leather straps that are woven together, and he's wearing tennis shoes with his slacks, and he looks so casual, and I think, this is the guy? Not expecting it. And he says, "Hey, have a seat." Very nice. And he starts pointing to he's got these diplomas and pictures and things on his wall, and he's telling me about where he got his law degrees, and I'm thinking, I don't care. I don't care about your law profession. And I'm polite, and I'm sitting there listening, and he talks for about 5 minutes about different stuff. And then I studied with Dallin Oaks' whatever he was saying. And then he didn't look at me once as he's pointing that stuff out. And then he looks at me and he says, "Why are you here?" And I almost wondered, in the moment, I thought, are you testing me? Like, do you want to know if I care about all this stuff? And I told him, I just ignored what he had said, and I said, "I'm here because I read your book, The Second Comforter. And I'm here because I want to ask about your witness of Christ." And I think that changed his demeanor a little bit, and he became a little bit more serious. And he says, "Yeah, what questions do you have?" And I said, "I want you to share with me your witness. And I basically let him know I'm here to judge you. I'm here because I believe what you've written, but I want to meet the man and look into your eyes," basically. And he was okay with that. And without sharing everything that he related, and I have recorded everything that he related.
Audio? You mean audio?
No.
I
went down and I journaled
Okay.
what he had shared with me. We met for about 20 minutes. He was late to a meeting that he was going to, but he was willing to take the time to sit and answer my questions. He shared with me a vision that he had had of Christ's resurrection. And that was an emotional thing for me. Here I was, as active as I could possibly be, in an LDS church, which I was utterly true to, aching every general conference to have someone tell me what I heard this guy, who doesn't even look like those guys, share with me in person. And it was absolutely important and moving to me to hear his testimony. And then he had to go, and he told me something I'll never forget. He said he knew nothing about me. I didn't share a thing about me that I can recall. He said, "The path that you are choosing to pursue will become increasingly lonely until you will have very few people you can talk to." And he says, "Keep reading what I'm writing." And then I shook hands and I walked out the door. He had just started his blog. And so I went home and I read his 4 blog posts or whatever it was. And I started reading the blog posts. I continued reading his books until I had read, up until today, day after day for a decade, every blog post he's ever written, every book he's ever authored. Depends on how you count them. There's 16 of them on my bookshelf. And no one has written more extensively about Mormonism in an impactful way than Denver Snuffer, in my opinion. And that's my opinion.
Not even Joseph Fielding Smith.
Not
Or Bruce
even,
R. McConkie.
Now, and to be clear, Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce McConkie were fundamental to my understanding and a foundation that they laid for me. They taught Seek the Face of Christ. You look in Millennial Messiah, you look in A New Witness for the Articles of Faith, you look in Mormon Doctrine, Bruce R. McConkie helped lay the foundation for the things I was seeking for. And he laid a foundation that helped me to accept the teachings of a Denver Snuffer, frankly. But no one has expounded on the scriptures pertaining to Mormonism in the way, in my view, that Denver Snuffer has. And I've read, basically, in my view, all there is to read about Mormonism. And so I go back and sit in my car, and I start to write down every word I can remember that he has, that he had shared with me. And the thought, as clearly as can be, was spoken into my mind, that is a true prophet. So that was my introduction to Denver. And I've come to recognize that voice as the voice of God.
What voice?
The voice that came into my mind when I sat in my car that spoke to me, saying that's a true prophet.
Was that the first time, or was that the same voice that bore witness about Joseph Smith?
Same voice.
It was the same voice.
Same voice, yep. It's been the same voice all throughout.
Is it an audible voice, or just a feeling, or thoughts to your mind?
Yeah, I've personally never, that I can recall, I might be wrong, I've never heard an audible voice.
So it's a thought to your mind.
I take that back. I have heard an audible voice, but it was by way of warning, like a watch out kind of a voice. I've heard that a couple of times. But as far as revelatory experiences are concerned, I have not heard an audible voice speak to me, but I have had a voice come into my mind and say things to me.
Okay.
And there's a difference.
Yeah. Is it known? Does Denver can you quote? Has he written or spoken publicly about his witnesses? And if so, can you tell us what you're allowed to tell us?
Sure, yeah.
About what his experiences have been?
Yeah, luckily for me, I can say whatever I want about it because everything I've learned about what he's taught has been publicly written. So the first place that I can recall that he shares about his witnesses in the book, The Second Comforter. All throughout, to the astute reader who's paying attention to what he's actually saying in all of his books, he is bearing his witness that the things I'm teaching you, I am not teaching you because I've studied so much, I just know this stuff now, but because I've learned from heaven certain things, and so now I have a different lens through which I'm viewing the scriptures, and I'm now able to teach you things from the scriptures because I've learned and seen these things for myself. And so that was my perception as I read his blog, as I read his books, is that he was often bearing testimony about his experiences, but not in a subtle LDS church leadership kind of way where he says, I know, capital letters, by words too sacred to share, that I've had, that God lives. It was by teaching us light and truth. And he was able to continually teach, year after year, things that expanded my view of the gospel in a way that I knew that he had experienced them for himself. Here's a good analogy. Having flown the F-15, if I had a pretender come to me and say, here's what it feels like to fly an F-15, and here's what the engines sound like when you are pulling a 9G turn at corner velocity and you're in full afterburner. Here's what it sounds like and feels like. If he's had the experience and he's genuinely describing the thing, then I can say, having had experiences with that myself, I know this person is telling the truth. They've had the experience. If someone who's read a lot about it but hasn't had the experience tries to tell me what it feels like and sounds like to be pulling that turn at corner velocity, or to start up the engines on an F-15 and sit up there, look over your shoulder in a BFM engagement, I can tell that you're not speaking from experience. You're speaking because you've read about it a lot. And I don't know if that's an apt example, but there's something subtle and a nuance to the experience of something that when people have had the experience and they talk about it, you can tell that there's a subtle difference in their ability to describe the experience. And after having heard someone write about and talk about having had the experience, I can go sit in general conference all day and listen to what they have to teach, and as good of messages as they are, they're not the authentic thing. And so that is for me yet again a data point. I've now encountered something that tastes good, as it were. It's delicious, and I can now, because of the proximity of the experience, have a better lens of discernment that I can then impose upon the world I'm seeing around me, in particular inside the LDS Church.
So just like Joseph Smith publishes an account, or multiple accounts, but he basically says, I was Grove of Trees,
Yeah.
upstate New York, God and Jesus came down, this is what they said to me. Has Denver given that level of detail about his witnesses? And if so, what can you tell us about what witnesses he's received and the details around it?
Yeah, there's a great website. I know there's a lot of websites flying around these days. It's called Restoration Archives, and they've done a good job compiling every book, talk, audio file, PDF file that Denver has ever produced publicly. And in there you can find his accounts. There are several talks that he has given in the recent couple of years at some of the conferences that we've had, where he shares visions that he's had of the second coming. He most recently, in his third of 3 talks to the Christian world out in Atlanta, he read from his book, Come Let Us Adore Him, about his personal witness of the atonement. And that's a place where you can go look to and read an account, both, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, he took word for word out of his journal and published it. He shared in that book his eyewitness account of the atonement and Christ's suffering in Gethsemane. And he shared his eyewitness account of the resurrection, the morning of the resurrection. In a talk that he gave in Boise, I believe, a year ago, he shares with the congregation there, if I'm not mistaken, his witness of Christ, of having received his experience, and then he shares his vision of the second coming. And so those are a few places, at least, where listeners could go to and actually read or listen to the audio of instances when he shared the details of those experiences. Okay,
so I just posted restorationarchives.com to the Facebook feed.
Great.
All right, so you leave that, it's 2009-ish.
2009 is when I first encountered, 2008 or 9 is when I encountered.
And you leave that encounter with the witness that Denver Snuffer's a prophet.
I do.
And this is prior to marrying Sara.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how did things go from there in your story?
Yeah, so I continue, for those that would be familiar with Denver's blogging, they would know, and I think Kirk and Karen point this out in their interview, that for a period, and that period lasts at least a year, it seems, if not 2, he is posting every day, twice a day, morning and night. And that gives you gospel food for thought every single day of your life. And so I'm reading that every single day. I'm praying about things. And what that did is it both expanded my view, but it also gave me encouragement that the path I had already been on was in fact a path that I should continue on. And at that point in my life, I have absolutely no intentions of ever. If you would have said I wasn't going to be a member of the church someday, wouldn't believe you. Absolutely not a thought about it. I was, in fact, always in callings in the church and always teaching in the church, and was content to do so forever. And but I also was interested in teaching things that I was learning. I wasn't teaching Denver Snuffer. But in fact, if I remember correctly, early on, there was nothing taboo about sharing a Denver Snuffer book with somebody because he's a member in good standing. It's a topic we don't talk a lot about, but most people aren't interested in reading new books, especially about a topic like that. So Sara and I get married in 2011. We're married in May of 2011 in the Mount Timpanogos Temple. At the time at which we've been married, we've been dating again for several months at least. Well, we dated for several months, got engaged, and then got married several months later. We were sealed in the temple by her uncle Joseph McConkie, who was a sealer in the temple.
Was he pretty old by that point?
Yeah, it was within a couple of years of his passing. It was.
He had taught on the BYU religion faculty for many, many years. He was the oldest son of Bruce R. McConkie.
He was the oldest surviving son of Bruce McConkie, and there was a Bruce Jr. who I think died at just several weeks old.
Okay. How many total kids do you know, Bruce?
9 children.
They had 9.
They did.
Okay. And is there anything you can tell us about marrying into the McConkie family?
Yeah,
or is it just normal, like marrying any family?
It's normal, like marrying into any family, and it is abnormal in some ways. One of there haven't been any people I've met who enjoy sitting around talking about the gospel more than the McConkie family, and so that's been terrific. In fact, I'm guessing. I think, if I'm not mistaken, maybe Sara's dad would even have recollections of when he was growing up, sitting on the doorstep with Joseph Fielding Smith and Bruce McConkie, his father, and listening to them talk about the gospel. I mean, so there's a different culture in the McConkie home than is typical of even unfortunately modern Mormon families. When you go home teaching today in the LDS church, it's almost like you kind of cringe when you say, "Okay, I got to share a message with you before I leave because I just asked you about your family and your work and your job and yada yada." But there's also the spiritual message part that we've got to share with you, and that's not true of every family, but that's true a lot of the time. It's not even commonplace to sit and the focus of your conversations just happens to revolve around church history or the gospel. But that is the case in the McConkie home. And so that's been a really neat thing about marrying into the McConkie family. Sara's siblings, Sara's the 7th of 9 children, and her siblings, both older and younger, are all studious, and they care about the gospel, and they know their scriptures. And so that's fun to be with a group of people who know their scriptures. And it's also challenging if your views don't line up with their views because they know their scriptures. And so some of the best conversations I've had in the recent couple of years have been with one of Sara's brothers who knows the scriptures very well, and he knows Mormon history very well. That's been fun and interesting. So, but yeah.
So they would have grown up with
family.
family meeting and scripture study. And did
Yeah.
Mark serve as a mission president? Was he stake president, bishop, the father?
No, he's been a stake president a couple of times. The father is Sara's father. They had and this is my understanding of their family culture, but they always have family prayers as they gather for dinner time. I don't know about the family home evening piece, if they did or didn't, but gospel study, scripture study is common, and the common method of scripture study or discussion is that Mark would teach the family. So I don't know if that's typical of McConkie families in general, but that's how Sara's family worked, and it's always wonderful. You go knowing that you're going to be instructed well in scripture or in church history.
Were there any interesting family lore about Bruce R. McConkie or his role in the church, or anything that you would remember that would be worth mentioning? I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
So
okay.
I had a roommate at BYU named Russ Watterson. I think he's a stake president in Denver area.
Okay.
He took a BYU religion class from a Margaret Pope, who was Bruce R. McConkie's sister. Is that right?
I think
You haven't heard of her?
I know who Margaret Pope is, but I don't know if she's Bruce's sister, or I think she might be.
Okay, so
but I might be mistaken.
So what he said is she would teach that Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith were blood descendants of Jesus, and that because Bruce R. McConkie married Joseph Fielding Smith's daughter, right?
He did, yeah.
Who had the blood of Joseph Smith through Hiram, right? That like McConkie children carried the blood of Christ in them. And that was like taught as a BYU course, like true or false, Joseph Smith had the literal blood of Christ.
Yeah.
So is that a McConkie family teaching, or have I got that wrong?
Not that I've So from my experience, I've never heard the McConkie family discuss those things.
Okay.
I have heard that before from reading Mormon history. And so if you read some of what Heber C. Kimball and Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff are saying and are recording in their journals and are talking about in their meetings, they're talking about that. But no, that's, as far as the McConkie family is concerned, there are simple vignettes about home life and that kind of thing that I've occasionally heard, but usually the setting in which we are, in a family setting, if there were things that were more of a personal nature, I wouldn't be able to share those here anyway. But as far as that kind of, that related kind of teaching that maybe is a part of early Mormon history, or lore as you might call it, whether it's true or false, I've not heard that kind of thing discussed in the McConkie.
So when you say they're noted for their deep discussions about gospel doctrine, were you ever a part of those? Have you been a part of those?
Yeah, often.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't go there.
Usually not. No. They're typically deeply rooted in the scriptures. They're rooted in well-documented church history items, and so that kind of stuff would probably either be viewed as speculation or as too sensitive or sacred. And this is my opinion. Again, this isn't something I've talked about with them, this issue that you brought up. But things of a speculative nature are not conversations that I've really typically had with the McConkie family. I'm guessing that in the privacy of their conversations, they too engage in wonderings and speculations and things. But in a family setting where maybe the father is teaching the family, it's usually doctrine. You picture Bruce McConkie at the pulpit teaching doctrine, and in a family setting, it's more comfortable. But there is Father McConkie who will teach his family doctrine from the scriptures, and that's the culture of the home.
Wow, that's intense.
And it's good. It's really wonderful gospel discussion.
Have you ever discussed with them? And we'll get right back to your story, but I'd like to set a little bit of context because you're marrying into the family, and that's interesting to a lot of people. And the sort of thing taught by Greg Prince or written about by Greg Prince about Bruce R. McConkie's book not being warmly accepted by David O. McKay and him being asked to rewrite it and that sort of thing, and then him making changes to Mormon doctrine over time. Is that the sort of thing you would have discussed with the McConkie family?
Not that I can recall. I don't remember, and I've known them for, Sara and I were married in 2011, and it was at that time that I more frequently have visited their home.
So 6 years.
Yep. But if we've had any discussion about that in particular, I don't think that it really had developed into anything, or it was maybe passing in nature. So anything I know about the facts, as I understand them, relative to the publishing of Mormon doctrine, are from my studies of the matter and not from discussions.
Have you read David O. McKay and the Rise of Modern Mormonism?
I have read parts of that book. And there have been some other compilations of letters and things put together. I think David Dye, in fact, has put together a book about the evolution of the publication of the Book of Mormon Doctrine. In there includes letters from David O. McKay and interactions that David O. McKay is having with Marky Peterson and Marion Romney, if I'm not mistaken, and just some of the discussion surrounding the initial publication of the book. I know that they go to Marky Peterson and say, hey, come back to us, and maybe Marion G. Romney as well, tell us what all the errors in the book are, as though he's the authority and not Bruce. Now, Bruce wasn't a member of the Quorum of the 12 at the time that he first published the book. And there was 1,067 errors that were discovered in the first publication of Mormon Doctrine. And and that's all, of course, subjective and according to the other guys who critiqued the book. And so I know that the book had, he'd been asked to remove the book from publication, which he did. And then later, I think in 1966, if I'm not mistaken. He is actually allowed to republish the book again with David O. McKay's consent, as long as some certain edits were made to the book, with the oversight of Spencer W. Kimball. That's my recollection of that, but that isn't something I've ever talked about in the home with.
How can you not talk about that? That was the first thing I would want to say is, hey, father-in-law Mark, I got some questions for you.
Well, maybe after they hear this interview, we might be talking about it a little bit.
All right. Okay, so you marry into the McConkie home.
Yep.
Joseph Fielding McConkie performs the wedding
Yes.
ceremony.
Yeah.
What is your feeling of the McConkie family as you're marrying into it? Did you realize, you obviously realized you were marrying the equivalent of Mormon royalty, right?
Yeah, my feelings towards the Mormon family the McConkie family were very good. And I think they had good feelings toward me. Got along very well. I'll keep pointing you back to Mark Jr. because you've mentioned him and now his name's been mentioned. Your relationship with him and your interactions with him that are so down to earth and so real and so nice. This is my relationship with the McConkie family.
Is he the oldest?
He is the oldest of Sara's siblings.
Okay. He was nice to you?
He's wonderful.
You passed the test? Did you pass his test? Did he
Mark
Did he
Jr.'s
give
test?
you his consent?
I don't remember there being a test, but I love him and I think he loves me.
Okay.
And he's wonderful.
Okay.
But yeah, we were sealed in the temple. That was a very good experience.
Why Timpanogos?
That was the temple that Joseph Fielding McConkie was a sealer in.
Okay.
And so we got.
Is that near his home?
Yeah. I don't.
Okay.
I don't. It's not real close, but.
Okay.
Yeah. So. Typical of the McConkie family, they're teachers, and so he taught during our temple sealing, and that was beautiful. It was really beautiful, and so we've recorded that, and then we were sealed, and then typical Mormon sealing, Mormon activity in the church. So that's all from an outsider's view, looking in, as it were, normal.
Okay. So you marry Sara, and then how does your faith progress?
Yeah, I personally continue to follow the same path. I introduce her to Denver's writings. She is willing to read them. She reads the first of the books, The Second Comforter, and she likes it and finds it compelling. And I think from there, she and I continue to have open dialogue about it, and she continues to read his books just like I had been. And so I was a couple of years ahead of her as far as what I had been reading, but I think I don't know that she's read all of his books, but she's read many of them. And she, like me, was believing when she was introduced to what it was that he was writing. In fact, I'll share this. She gave the book The Second Comforter to her father as a gift, and asked that he would read it.
To Mark.
To
Senior.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And he agreed to read it, and he read it, and to my recollection, enjoyed the book. But after the passage of some time and some discussions, I think, with folks, he had come to discover that this is, in fact, not a good man, a dangerous man. He is on the chopping block, and he will soon be excommunicated from the church for apostasy. Because none of that had happened at the time when Sara and I were married in 2011. And so of course, they're very concerned about what Sara and I were reading and who we were reading.
Did they express that concern?
They did.
Talk about that.
I'll talk about it briefly. But of course, as you could imagine, they expressed, Sara's father expressed in writing to Sara that I'm basically warning you against continuing down the path that you're on and reading and learning from this teacher. And if you don't know already, he's really getting into trouble with his leadership, and he's going to be excommunicated. And so you're following the wrong guy, basically, is what he warns in the letter. And that was disappointing, of course, to Sara, because she believes what she's reading. And she was hoping that her father would be compelled to believe that this guy is telling the truth about his witness. And so as time goes on, more and more, it seems, we are convinced that Denver not only is telling the truth, but has things to teach us. And on the other hand, some of our family members, and this is both sides of the family, my family and her family, are increasingly concerned about the path that we are choosing and what it is that we're reading.
Who in your family was concerned about you?
In particular, I have a younger brother who has been concerned and vocal. And we've had some dialogue and discussion over the years about what it is that I was learning and believing. And I think some of it he's found interesting, and at other times he's not found it compelling, and so he disagreed with our path.
Yeah. Is he the dentist or doctor?
He is, yeah.
Okay.
He's currently a dentist, he's in an oral surgery internship down in San Antonio.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll break in at this point to say, if we get a good breaking point for the end of a part one here, I'd appreciate it for a restroom break.
Okay.
Say that publicly.
Immediately or
close to immediately.
All right. Well, it looks like we are going to take a break on Mormon Stories podcast. I'm going to read a couple comments and take a couple questions. Why don't you go ahead and unclip your microphone? 12:30? 12:15? All right, so we're gonna do about 45 more minutes of this segment, and I'm going to really quickly read some comments and questions from the audience. Leonard writes, Margaret Pope was a neighbor of mine growing up, and she is the sister of Sara McConkie. Thank you, Leonard, for confirming that. Let's see. Sharon asks, is the purpose of Mormon Stories to help strengthen our faith or to purport anti-stuff? The last two I've seen weren't very faith-promoting. I know information is good, and maybe I've missed more positive stories. Well, Sharon, I guess faith-promoting is in the eye of the beholder. I think there's a lot of people that feel like the Strongs and Matt are very faithful people. I tend to agree. I mean, they take the Book of Mormon and their faith in God very, very seriously, and they're encouraging faith in Jesus. So from the standpoint of faithful, I guess it just depends. Mormon Stories doesn't have a position on whether people should stay LDS or leave the LDS Church. What we want people to do is to have as much information as they can to make informed decisions about their lives. So we allow people to tell stories from all different angles, from faithful, active, conservative, Orthodox believing members to more conservative members. We interviewed Mormon fundamentalists. Ann Wild was someone we interviewed early on who was a polygamist. We'll interview people following Denver Snuffer sort of philosophies or theories or teachings. But we also interview people who have left the church, or we interview progressive Mormons that don't believe some or all of what the church teaches, or don't practice some or all of what the church says you should do. So liberal and progressive Mormons all the way to people who have left the church and are atheists and don't believe in anything. So we just want, our goal at the Open Stories Foundation is to give people as much information as they can so that they can make informed decisions about their lives. And then whether they stay in or out of the church, faithful, not faithful, believing in God and Christ, that's not our business. Our business is to have the conversations that, frankly, members of the church during church are too scared to have. Because people deserve to hear different points of view. They deserve to have open, candid discussions and to know everything about what they're giving their time, their money, their energy, their commitment, their lives to. And so I hope that answers your question. John, can you bring Mike Norton in on the conversation, please? That's a weird request. From Stephen, my buddy Stephen. Really quickly, someone's asking us to confirm or deny the authenticity of the recently released Mormon Leaks McConkie documents. Are we going to talk about that later, or do you want to answer that now?
I wasn't planning to, but I'm happy to answer the question.
Okay, go ahead.
The authenticity of them? Yeah, they're authentic.
Okay.
And I'll say it was...
what was released generally? This was Mormon Leaks,
Mm-hmm.
Ryan McKnight and his, cohort.
Yeah, I haven't read all of the documents that have been released. I don't think my wife has either. But we have perused through those documents to see what it is that's shown up. And I know they've been released or leaked in 2 different installments. And if I'm not mistaken, there's at least dozens of documents. They're typically unpublished sermons or talks that he was preparing, or potentially books or papers or Ensign articles or what have you, that he had prepared that were never published. Anytime there is an expectation of privacy of certain materials and that is not met or it is violated, of course a family would take that as a blow. And so the materials there, and in saying this, it's not surprising. It's captured in the leaks themselves. They came from a diary of one of the McConkie family members, and that diary, I think, was probably shared with other family members in the years past, and maybe by a disc or something. And then those journal entries and unpublished sermons that were shared with family, because they wouldn't spread those abroad, they'd only share those with family, were then shared with other family members who then potentially ultimately shared those with friends who happened to feel like it would be a real good idea to leak those. Now, so the family was aware that had happened. I think you even see on the Leaks website that there is some dialogue with someone in the McConkie family and or their attorney, and there's a discussion about trying to take those documents down and off the website, and I don't know that they ever have been. I think they're still up there on the website.
And the McConkie family feels what about those documents being shared?
I think in one sense it's just fine that they're shared, because a lot of the teachings are things that you, if you've read Bruce McConkie, have already been exposed to or familiar with. There's nothing earth-shattering in what's been released, but I think it's just simply that privacy expectation that they might have had, that, hey, these were in my journal, how did they end up on this guy's website? And because of that, that's troubling and it's hurtful, and so that's my perception anyways, and really the only people that Sara and I spend most of our time with is her family, her parents, because we live in Colorado Springs with them. But I haven't talked to Sara's siblings about their thoughts or feelings about that. I think there was, of course, a reaction initially for a week or two, but I haven't heard any chatter or discussion about it in the home at all since then. I think they've kind of just let it go, moved on. Yeah.
Okay. So going back to your story, Sara shares the Denver Snuffer book with her dad, Mark,
Yep.
who you say has been a stake president a couple times. He likes the teachings, based on your recollection, but then when he inquires to Salt Lake, he gets the word that Denver's a marked man and that you should stay away.
Yeah.
Talk about how, obviously there's nothing more important to McConkies than faith and religion.
Yep.
And there's nothing more important to you than faith or religion. You're the son-in-law. From their perspective, you're dragging her down to hell, so to speak, and you're living in the same town as them. So talk about how things progress as you're becoming more and more believers and the in-laws are concerned, probably deeply concerned.
Yeah, I'll make a couple of corrections, I think. So we weren't living in Colorado Springs at the time that
okay.
Sara shares that book. We are now.
Where were you?
Because we're military, we've moved around quite a bit.
Okay.
So we've, to be honest, we were living in Oklahoma when we got married. Then we lived in Texas for a little bit. Then we lived in Oregon.
Got it.
Then we lived in Japan. And then we moved to Colorado.
Okay, hopping around.
And so we've been hopping around. And to be fair to Sara's dad, who read the book, and I said he liked it, he also did share with us it's not without flaw.
Sure.
So he took issue with some of the, I think, doctrinal ideas in the book, but not the overall premise of the book. And you mentioned that he talked to Salt Lake. That's not necessarily accurate. He he is having conversations with, I think, family and friends about the book, wherever they might have been. And in the course of those conversations, I think has turned off quite a bit from the book. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
So, but because one of the questions that we've been asked by family and friends, and not just once or twice, but throughout the past couple of years, is why were you so secretive with your beliefs? When you try and share something with those that you love and they oppose it.
Who are you secretive to first?
So family and friends felt like when they found out years after years go by and they find out, hey, you're not members of the LDS Church anymore. What's going on? Wait, you mean you believe this, that, and the other? How come you've never shared that with us? How come you were so secretive about your path or your beliefs?
Okay, before you get there, but
Sure
you're
thing,
telling your father-in-law, you're sharing the book with him.
Well, so yeah, you've asked how does that kind of progress, and so I'm jumping forward a little bit to kind of paint. I'm going to paint backwards a little bit here,
Okay.
but so one of the questions people have asked is why have you been so secretive? Now rewind back to when we're trying to share a book with family. We gave that book to several different individuals. We gave it to family, we gave it to friends, we gave it to coworkers. Because it was so impactful to us. And when those that you love the most are openly opposed to and share with you and warn you about the path that you're on and tell you that they're not interested in what it is that you shared with them, in one sense, there is absolutely no good reason to continue to press them about your beliefs. I don't care that you don't want to know about this. I'm going to continue to tell you about it, and you're going to believe it one day. There's no utility in trying to push your beliefs on someone. And so when you're met with opposition, what that naturally tends to do is to have you practice your religion in private. It tends to make you not want to continue to bring it up at dinner tables. And you don't want to continue recommending new books. And so months would go by where we don't have any conversation with my family or Sarah's family about what it is we're reading, what it is, some new understanding that we've got. That wasn't a common discussion item. In fact, we talked about church and our callings and stuff that everyone felt comfortable discussing. And then as time goes on and the culmination of our beliefs ultimately leads to church discipline, which we'll talk about later, then for some reason it was surprising to some people that we hadn't been sharing with them all along what it was that we were up to. And it shouldn't be surprising to people why it is that we chose to keep our religion to ourselves. We're trying to, one, be respectful of you and your path. We're not trying to make you uncomfortable. But we're content. Every person has the right to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. And so if you choose to not want to pursue this path, peace, we'll let you go about your path, and we're not interested in disrupting it. And so for our family anyways, that was kind of our approach. And so,
how did that feel to know that members of your family cared so much about talking about doctrine and the gospel, and yet you couldn't share with them the things you were learning, the things that were most precious to you? Was it okay because you're in your own family and you're only worrying about your own stuff? Or was it sad for you on a level?
It is sad on a level. Sara and I both like talking about the gospel. One of my frustrations about the church was that I found myself there every week unable to openly discuss the gospel. I mean, it just drove me nuts.
Wait, you couldn't discuss the gospel
at church? You can discuss the leaders of the church at church, and you can discuss the lesson from the manual at church, but you can't, you don't. I remember I taught I was an institute teacher for some time, and the institute director for the region came and listened to my lesson. And I was teaching about Joseph Smith, and I talked about the book of Abraham, and I went into one of the facsimiles a little bit. And after the lesson was over, this guy pulled me aside, and he says, "You did a remarkable job. Your lesson was so fascinating, but I have to caution you. The facsimiles of the book of Abraham have no place in an institute class." And I thought, what? Is this a part of your gospel and your religion, or is it not? And so here was
Was
this.
he worried that people would learn to question the Book of Abraham?
I don't know what is, but I actually questioned that, and I said, what do you mean the facsimiles from the Book of Abraham don't have a place? And he says, your lesson was powerful enough without having to bring in facsimiles. And by the way, the lesson manual, and so, I mean, there's a culture that is almost unbreakable. There's a bubble. And when you're in it and you believe in it, you cannot pierce the bubble, the walls of that bubble, and start to see things. Being outside of the church now, it is very easy to see the impact of a culture on me, upon a community of people within the LDS church.
It's basically correlation.
And that's a big part of it.
But some would say Bruce R. McConkie was part of creating that shell, that bubble. This is what you talk about. This is what you don't. Follow the brethren. Is that fair?
In my view, the work that people like Elder McConkie did or Joseph Fielding Smith did was fundamentally important to the clarification of key doctrines or tenets, principles of the gospel in a way that was beneficial to the saints. There's a consequence with correlation. David O. McKay warned about that consequence, and he said it would lead the church into apostasy. That's a big problem, right?
Which you think it has?
Yeah, I think that there's a problem when you're so afraid to talk about something that isn't in the correlated material that you're absolutely paralyzed in your ability to explore the gospel. And so, to answer your question, there hasn't been an LDS apostle scholar like Bruce McConkie since Bruce McConkie, and his teachings were absolutely fundamental to my worldview. But I see clearly too the detriment of Mormon correlation. And
was Packer not a scholar, or Bednar? They wouldn't count. Some see them as as like the
continuation.
The spirit of Bruce R. McConkie lived on through Boyd K. Packer and
they've all had useful. Some of them are powerful teachers. I've really liked listening to some of them teach. I very much liked a lot of Elder Packer's stuff. I've liked listening to Elder Bednar or Elder Uchtdorf. I think they can be powerful speakers. And Elder Christofferson I've really enjoyed. Sometimes Elder Holland I really enjoy. And so I'm not willing to say that I've not enjoyed thoroughly listening and learning from them. But the path and trajectory in the church right now, or of the church and its teachings and its doctrine, it's becoming so fundamentally watered down that even those very good teachers would be unwilling to even repeat some of the things that Bruce McConkie was saying just a few decades ago. A good example of that.
Well, they've taken Bruce R. McConkie's book out of print, right? Mormon Doctrine's like no longer printed and sold by the church. True?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of reasons behind that, and it might not have to do with being afraid of what's in it. It might have to do with money and with sales and with new competing books. That's a personal opinion.
Priestcraft, basically.
But I will say that I lost my train of thought.
Sorry.
Oh yeah. So this idea of the Mormon Church is on a trajectory where it's not capable of allowing certain teachings to spread because it can't continue to there are too many people that have access to the internet, and there are too many people that are learning too much stuff, and they're really trying to clamp down and really get a hold on what people learn and don't learn. They've even had to open up and write these anonymous essays and publish them on various gospel topics because, after all, members are all starting to learn about this stuff, and if we don't say that we've been writing about it for some time, it's going to look like we've been hiding it. And so we're going to publish these essays, and we're going to publish them anonymously, and we're not going to put a date on them. Oh, you haven't seen the essays? They're online. We've had this on the LDS.org for a long time. Elder Oaks recently was willing to go to Boise, Idaho, with one of the leading church historians, and to try and convince a congregation of saints that they shouldn't seek for the experience of the second comforter because it's a familiar trick of the devil. Compare that with Bruce McConkie's teachings in A New Witness for the Articles of Faith, or his conference talks, or the Messiah series, the Millennial Messiah in particular. They're completely at odds with one another. And yet the current church's teaching is that trust us, look to us, we can't lead you astray. How is that true when fundamentally you're teaching things that are opposed to leaders that were just 3 and 4 decades ago? And it was all, by the way, to convince people up there. They heard there was a stirring up in Boise over Denver Snuffer, in my opinion. And Elder Oaks went there to attempt to convince them that they shouldn't be seeking for the second comforter. And so he's willing to preach against the gospel, Antichrist, in order to silence a movement and in order to shut up Denver Snuffer. And to me, that's wicked.
On Mormon Stories, you just heard Dal Oaks called an Antichrist and wicked.
The teachings are Antichrist. The teachings are wicked.
Yeah.
I don't know Elder Oaks as a man, and I'm willing to bet he's probably a really nice man. Those teachings are Antichrist.
Yeah. Because
Christ has commanded us to seek his face. A man who claims to be an apostle in God's church is saying that that's a teaching of the devil. To me, what you're saying is that the teaching that Christ has given us in the scriptures and through his prophet Joseph Smith are from the devil. I'm not interested in learning anything from you anymore. And so for me, when I see that stuff taking place, not only does that, and I'll tell you, I'm guessing it had the same effect upon hundreds of Latter-day Saints who are familiar a little bit with these topics in Boise. When they hear an apostle show up talking about don't seek for the face of Christ in this life, they're going to start to raise their eyebrows and think, what are they up to? What's their motive? Because if you read Elder Oaks a decade ago, he's talking about some of this stuff, and now he's warning you against it. Big problem that they're having to face now, and it's a result of fear and their willingness to step out and speak out against what they think is a threat to the church.
Real quick, isn't there some exchange between Bruce R. McConkie and like Glenn Pace about McConkie warning people to not seek personal relationship with Christ?
There was a talk that Elder McConkie gave. I don't remember the title of it, but it had something to do with the Godhead and the proper relationship between us as members of the church and members of the Godhead. And that was, as my understanding is, in direct relation to some, maybe it was Glenn Pace, like you said, teachings that I think were maybe being taught at BYU or promulgated about developing a personal relationship with Christ. I'm not familiar with what all of those teachings were. I can't remember. But I think he gave a very powerful talk warning against that very attitude. Yeah.
So it's a little bit confusing. Was he against the second comforter or for it? Or do you even know?
No, I'm familiar enough with what he's written that he is an advocate of seeking the face of Christ in this life. If you read through the talk that he gives, and I haven't read it or listened to it in the last few years, he's trying to caution and warn the saints about the impropriety of your worship and your devotion is focused on the Father in the name of Christ by the power of the Holy Ghost. That is the proper relationship of your worship. But there are some individuals who have a gospel hobby horse, and I don't know if he uses those words in his talk, where they are so intent upon their relationship with Christ, and there might be more to the teachings behind the scenes of what those folks were talking about that I'm not aware of that he was. And he's basically warning the saints and trying to teach them about the proper respectful relationship between man and deity. I'm not saying that today at this point I fully agree with what he taught in that talk. I'd have to read it again. But I think that it was out of a genuine concern for what he saw happening behind the scenes, whatever that was, as a genuine threat to a healthy spiritual relationship with deity. But that's
listeners are saying it was George Pace.
George Pace, okay.
Not Glenn Pace, that's me.
George
I
Pace.
think I got it wrong. Okay, so you guys decide to keep your beliefs, you and Sara decide to keep your beliefs to yourself.
By and large, yeah.
Let's take it. Let's talk to us more about the progression of where things start to become problematic or awesome.
Yeah, both, incidentally. So, and how much time do we have? I don't want to get cut off.
We've got about 30 minutes.
Um,
Is it 20? Okay.
So there's an experience that I have that's important as well that I should share. And I don't want to talk too much about. Some of this is personal to my family. But I have the second oldest in my family. My younger sister was severely handicapped since she was born, and my mom, in particular, took care of her for the 30+ years that she was alive. And in the last decade of her life, she wasn't able to walk at all. She had an electric wheelchair, wasn't able to push a wheelchair with her own strength. I need to bring this up because it relates to a vision that I had, and it's an important part of our journey. So in 2000 and late 13 or early 2014, it's nighttime. I am asleep, but I have a vision, and you could call it an inspired dream. I've had lots of dreams. But this was a vision, and I know that I was walking down a path, and I look up in the distance and I see a beautiful building, and I'm intrigued by the building, and I'm walking alone as far as I can tell. And as I approach the building, I notice that it has many doors, many windows, and it looks to me Mormon. It looks to me like kind of a similitude of a Mormon temple. But it's much taller and quite a bit wider. And I'm intrigued, and I go into the building, and I notice that it has many rooms. And those rooms are simple, but decorated beautifully, and they're reminiscent of a celestial room. And I begin to eagerly pursue each room and to investigate what's in each room in the building. And I'm really surprised to discover that there is no one around, and the building's completely empty. And it's clear to me that because I've been in several rooms and there's no one in those rooms, that there's no one in the building. It's vacant. And I leave the building and I walk back out onto the path that I was pursuing, and I continue in the same direction that I had originally been traveling. And I get far enough away from the building to turn around and look back at the building. And as I look back at the building, I notice that the building is completely flat. There's absolutely no substance to it. It's hollow, it's vacant, it's leaning backwards, and it would fall down if it wasn't leaning on a different building that's behind it. There was a different building that was behind it that was large and solid. It looked unkempt, it looked neglected, and it was gray, as though, and the building in the front was colorful and beautiful, as though it had been there for a lot longer than the building in the front that was thin and shallow and leaning upon it. And it was solid and sturdy, and it was the building upon which the front building was leaning that enabled the front building to continue to stand. And it was apparent to me at the moment that the front building represented the LDS Church. It was shallow, it had become hollow, it was becoming vacant. And the only reason it was still standing is because the true gospel that was revealed through Joseph Smith was a solid structure that was going to stand forever. And if you were to take that away, that building would fall and crumble. And at that point in the vision, I noticed that my sister, Gina, is standing next to me, and she's walking with me on the path. And then I woke up. And instantly...
She's your disabled sister?
And she was my disabled sister who couldn't walk. And instantly upon waking, I began to reflect upon what I'd just seen. And I say waking because I was in a sleepful state.
And this is when in your...
This is late 2013, okay. Early 2014. Sara and I are married.
Oh, wow. Okay.
We are listening to Denver's 10 lectures
Were you traveling to try and attend them?
We were
in
living
person?
in Japan for the first half of those, and so no, we didn't fly back from Japan to catch any of them. We got them after the fact online. So I have this vision in which I see these buildings. I wake up and I think, what did that mean? And I know that the buildings represented the gospel and the church. And what did it mean that Gina was walking next to me? And very clearly the impression came to me that her appearance in the dream or vision was a chronological marker of when things were to happen. That doesn't make sense unless I explain it, but I had every desire as a result of that vision, in the moment that I'm considering its meaning, to proclaim to others that I had discovered the truth of the fact that the LDS Church had become a hollow replica of the original, and that the original is the only foundation that the LDS Church can lean upon and have any kind of meaning. And that my sister's appearance standing next to me and walking beside me on the path means that when she passes, I will have an obligation to speak up. And so several months go by and she passed away. And she was, my sister was very influential, an influential glue in my family. And
did she have full cognitive abilities?
she did. Yeah, severely physically handicapped, full cognitive abilities, and a witty thinker, blogger, Doctor Who lover, just wonderful.
And she lived till
And she lived until 30. She's born in 83, and she passes away in 2014. And so she's 31 years old, I think. And in that moment, I felt a sense of responsibility and calling from the Lord to make it clear where I stood, to not sit quietly and allow something like "trust us, we can't lead you astray" to be taught to people who I loved, my family, the members of the ward that I loved. And so I made it a determination that I would take a stand for truth. And that didn't mean I was going to go ruffle feathers, but I needed to not passively stay silent about things that mattered to me and that I felt were impacting the souls of men. And so that's what leads to me writing a letter to my stake president, is my obligation to speak up about the truth. And I wasn't willing to go start causing a ruckus in my ward, but I thought, my temple recommend is coming due. I need to write a letter to my stake president and tell him why I'm going to answer certain questions the way that I am going to. Namely, he's going to ask me if I support and sustain the leaders of the church as prophets. And I'm not willing to do that anymore. And so in order to make that clear, so there was a fall conference, I think it was the fall, it was the fall, wherein there were 3 speakers who spoke in general conference of the LDS Church, all teaching very emphatically that you need to trust us, we can't lead you astray. And that lit enough of a fire in me to pen a letter, that 7-page letter, I think, is what it is, that I gave to you that you read, in which I mention those speakers, I mention what they were teaching, I put indirect quotes, and then I try to share from, I think, over 30 scriptures and some quotes from Joseph and even Brigham Young, how that is not a true doctrine. The idea that you should trust a man and that they won't lead you astray is false. And that is when I call the teaching Antichrist. And it's strong language. We think Sherem, Nehor, Korihor, and we shy away from those words. But the fundamental truth is, if you're preaching,
I get called them all the time.
You might get called that all the time, and so you're used to it, and so you're used to the language, right?
Yeah, Nehor, Korihor.
But for me, I needed to explain to my leadership. I'm in the Elders Quorum presidency. My wife is an early morning seminary teacher, which we should talk about, by the way, too, because the students loved her class, and I need to explain in writing to the people who I sustain as leaders why it is I can't answer the temple recommend questions the way that they would expect me to. That's what led to the letter. And I asked them in the letter, at the end of the letter, to repent of false teachings and to teach the truth. And by the way, I've laid out the truth for you here in this letter, is basically what I say. And that, of course, is viewed as arrogant and of proud and of not being willing to take instruction. And I was okay with that because God knew my heart. I've come to a point in my life where it doesn't matter to me what someone thinks about me. What matters to me is that in my heart and in my conscience, I'm trying to comply with what I feel is an obligation that's devolving upon me from God. So that's what leads to the letter.
So I just shared the letter in the Facebook live stream. For those who want to download it, it's a really powerful letter. We're going to go over it. But just so I can summarize in terms
Sure,
of the
please.
narrative of the story, your sister's death prompts a vision.
Back up. That prompted me taking action based on a vision that I had had while she was still alive.
While she was alive, you
she
have a
was alive.
vision.
Yeah.
You're concerned about her. Is she? Did you know during the vision that she was close
Good
to
question.
dying?
She, for many months, had been deteriorating to the point where we anticipated within a year or two that she might pass away.
So you were worried about your sister whom you loved. Her health was deteriorating. You have a vision that she's involved in. That's sort of a vision that to you means that the LDS Church is kind of not going in the right direction.
Yeah, I had already discovered for several years that the LDS Church was on a path that was losing light and truth, and it was on a path that I found divergent from the original gospel that had been restored through Joseph. That was my view. And so for me, that experience that I have of the inspired dream or vision that I had was, to me, not teaching me that the LDS Church was hollow and shallow. I'd already discovered this in many ways, but that rather, now that I understand this information, and I have been on a path that has brought me into that building and out from that building, I now find myself on a path when my sister is deceased because she is walking next to me. And that was a chronological marker, if you will, and it told me that there will come a time, and it will be after she has passed, where you will be required by me, God, to take a stand for the truth and to speak up, if that makes sense.
And so, upon her passing, you feel prompted that that's the time to write the letter.
Yeah,
to your stake president.
At the time of her passing, I knew that it was time for me to take a stand for truth. I had no intentions of writing a letter. She passes away on July 18th of 2014, and on July 19th of 2015, we were excommunicated from the church a year later. And after she passes on July 18th, several months go by and General Conference happens, and it's as a result of those talks that I feel like I need to write a letter to the stake president.
Okay, those that happened in fall of 2014.
The fall of 2014.
Right? I have to note something. A lot of Joseph Smith's angst about the afterlife was because of his brother Alvin passing. Did you connect in any way to Joseph Smith about having a sibling pass? Did you even make that connection? And I'm just struck by how intertwined your sister's passing is with your feelings about Christ and the movement. And I just wonder how much you've reflected upon the connectivity and relationship with all that.
I can't say that I was at the time thinking about Joseph's. He and Emma had a lot of experience with death.
Little children pass away, yeah.
And I've reflected on that often, but I can't recall that during that time in my life that was a connection I was making. But I will say that I should probably not continue to talk about this, and it is personal in nature, so I apologize to the listenership for being personal about my personal life. But all of the members of my immediate family, my father and my mother, and me, and now 2 younger siblings who are still alive, are all the people that we are today, whatever that means to us. We all have the views that we entertain today, and we all have the world view that we have today because of my sister.
Why is that?
No question about it.
Why is that?
There is something, I think everyone is influenced and impacted by their own personal circumstances. And for you, that's different than from me and from your listener named Mike, whoever that might be. Whoever we are, we've all got some things in our lives that have really made us who we are. And one of those major things was 30 years of living with our sister, and having and having her in our home, and the interaction that we had with her, us being all physically capable people, athletes, and having a sister in the home who, when she turned 16, couldn't get a driver's license because she didn't have the strength to push on the gas pedals and the brakes and the motor skills to, and realizing that, hey, I'm not going to end up developing like all of my peers. And so that tenderness that brought to each of us, I think shaped our perceptions of the world. And so I feel particularly affected by her life. When I look at others, I feel I am personally affected by the lessons I learned from her and how I then view others, I think. And it's helped me to be more compassionate.
Do you know what her beliefs were towards the end of her life?
Yeah, she was baptized into the LDS Church. That's a good question, by the way. She became more and more private in her life. She wasn't able to go to church for many years, and by the time she passed away, I don't know that my mom and dad were still actively participating in the LDS Church anyway. I can't remember. But that isn't something that she would openly discuss with my mom or my dad. But she had been baptized into the LDS Church and had been active while she was physically able to go to church. The path I was pursuing, all this isn't something I'd talk about with her. This was, we would show up, we'd spend time together. She lived a hermit life. She lived at home with mom and dad. She watched her shows. She had her radio shows. So anyway, more than I ever anticipated I would share about her on this podcast, but the important reason for me to bring it up is because seeing her walking next to me was an important indicator for me about the timing involved with when the Lord expected me to take action.
Do you wish you could have bore witness to her before she passed, or do you wish
No.
you could have found out what she believed?
No, I'm perfectly content that each life has its own struggles, circumstance. I had no intentions of teaching to her what my views are, and I think that, and I'll say this without sharing the experience. On that note, a year after she passed, I was up in the mountains. I was praying to God, and I wanted Him to convey something to her for me, and I think that was done. So I'll leave it at that.
Are you comfortable sharing what you wanted to tell her?
Nope.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm confident that was done. Sorry about the emotions.
Stop apologizing. We're pro emotions on Mormon Stories, and we're pro personal stories.
I know I'm making my mom cry at home. Probably is what's happened. That makes me even more emotional. So I'll stop. But all of us are very grateful for the family that we had. It was all of us have circumstances that shape us, and so that's why I bring that up.
Well, so we have 200 listeners plus that have hung in over this entire interview. We're really grateful for everyone who's been tuning in. It's been a great audience. We've heard so many great things about your story so far. So, Matt, it's been super moving. Thank you so much for what you've shared. Listeners, this is what we're going to do. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to recharge my cell phone. We're going to grab lunch. And we're going to start in about an hour or so. And we're going to cover Matt's excommunication with the stake president. We're going to talk about the fallout that this happened for Matt, for his immediate family, for Sara, for the McConkie family, for Matt's, for the Lohmeiers, for others, and just kind of what it's like and how he interacted with his ward and his stake and how they handled that. Then we're going to talk about the movement. We're going to talk about where it is. We're going to talk about the scriptures. We're going to talk about the covenant that they recently made. We talk about Zion, talk about the New Jerusalem, talk about all that stuff and how things are shaping up in the movement. And then maybe I'll ask some final questions about the kinds of things that I would struggle with, or the questions that I would have about the consistency or the doctrine or the teachings or the problems. We'll get into things from the CES letter, problems with Mormon history, Mormon doctrine, historicity, and we'll try and cover those a bit since Matt's willing to talk about it. That's not, I don't think, central to this interview, but I think a lot of us would be curious how he would answer questions about the Book of Mormon, Book of Abraham, historicity, Joseph Smith's polygamy. A lot of controversy over whether or not Joseph was a polygamist. So we'll talk about all that from Matt's perspective. We didn't get into that as much with the Strongs. But stay tuned on Mormon Stories. We're going to have at least another 2 or 3 good hours with Matt. And we'll cover a lot of good stuff. So thanks for tuning in. If you want to email or message me or post questions or comments, we'd love to incorporate them to the second half of this interview. But we're grateful for everyone who's tuned in. Thanks for everyone who supports Mormon Stories podcast. Go to mormonstories.org. If you want to support us financially, 10, 20, $100 a month, whatever you can afford, allows us to have a nonprofit, a staff, accountants, transparency, marketing, technology budget, all that stuff comes from your support. So we just want to thank everyone who makes this possible. Thank Matt for tuning in, and please join us in about an hour on the Mormon Stories podcast Facebook page for part 2 of my live Facebook interview with Matt Lohmeier. Take care, everybody. Talk to you soon.